Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Python. I am Carlos Acosta, and I will be your instructor for the first few weeks of this course. In part 1, we'll go over a brief introduction to integrated development environments, IDEs, data types, such as variables, strings, and numbers, the operation with objects, lists and arrays, data type conversions, if statements, while loops and for loops, and functions and definitions. In part 2, we will go over scope of variables, classes, and read and write to files along with command line programs. So first of all, what is programming? Programming is the process of converting ideas into instructions that a computer can reproduce. For example, autopilot on an airplane, the phone application, video games, or the control system on AC system. For example, for air conditioning, you take measured values of temperature and you decide if you need to turn the compressor on or if it's below the threshold of temperature that you're operating under. The response time and accuracy is usually one of the restrictions for the code. If you're running thousands of lines of code and it requires the input and output of reading files or the sensing of a variable such as temperature and pressure, then you have to do filtering of the signal and you have to do iterations over the values that you compute. This usually takes time. So the time is often one of the restrictions on the codes. If one of the goals of your code is to be fast, then the designer or programmer has to tailor the operation towards a fast code with little redundant operations. But what is a programming language? Well, a programming language is basically a compilation of rules with a determined syntax and semantics or meaning organized in a code. For example, in English we say thank you, in French you say merci, in Spanish you say gracias, in Italian you say grazie, in Russian you say spasibo, and etc. Programming language is similar. In C, you have a for loop, whereas in Fortran, you do something very similar with a do loop. The syntax is different, but the concept is the same. So how to write code? Well, for probably the first question to ask is what operating system I need to use. So if the goal of your project is to manage clusters or servers or clouds, then Linux is probably the best way to go. But if you want to code a script, an app, or your own project, then Windows and Mac are perfectly fine. I've used all three of them, and Linux and Mac are by far the easier to learn, but Windows, it's also very easy as long as you have the proper IDs and the libraries set up correctly. So part of this tutorial is going over installing the IDE for Windows. The second question is deciding on the programming language and text editor. So for this particular course, we're going to go over Python, but C++ and Fortran are common languages also used. And once you know the logic behind programming in any language, you can use whatever you want. The only thing that changes is the structure and particular concepts in how to formulate the code. Once you decide on what language to use, you have to choose your IDE because large projects probably require a way to deal with the files. Therefore, if you're doing C++ or C#, Visual Studio is one common IDE. If you're dealing with Python, then PyCharm, Jupyter, Spyder are common IDEs. Once you decide on the code or programming language in the IDE, you can start your code, but often your code requires certain schemes that are already developed. and some of them are not open source. Therefore, if you want to build a controller and you want Simulink, then you probably want to go for MATLAB. Or if you want to do expressions in terms of variables and not in terms of numbers, then you can use Maple or Mathematica. Or if you want to do is purely do statistical analysis, then R and SAS are probably the best options. But in our case, we're gonna go over Python. And for that, we're gonna need Python and the IDE. So how to run code? There are two ways to convert code into a machine code. The machine code is basically the set of instructions that the computer understands and executes. The first way is through a compiler, which is commonly the case for a code written in C, C++, or Fortran. And the second way is the interpreter, which is what Python, PHP, and JavaScript use. The difference is basically that the compiler will create a file that the machine will understand, and the machine will just deal with that file every time you run the code. The interpreter, you run the code every time, and the interpreter will take care of the instructions to make the machine understand what you want. So when you build your code, you probably don't need to worry about this part, but it's good to know when you have programs in C and C++ or Fortran that sometimes your code is perfectly fine and the error is in the compiler. Then you have to focus on the compiler part. So we're going to go ahead and see how to start with Python. So if you have Python installed, you basically go to the installation window of Python, which in my case is 3.8.2. This is called the shell. And notice that you can call A equals 1 and B equals 2, and Python will know that when I do A plus B, C will be A plus B. However, if you want to see what C is, then you want to print C equals my value stored in C. Right? C equals 3. So what is happening here is that Python understands that this means that my value of 1 now is going to have or be stored on in A, and B stored in will be 2, and C will now store or allocate the value of A plus B. This is very trivial, but I want to show that by default, any language will understand 4 operations, which are summation, subtraction, multiplications, and division. So if you do C equals A times B, now we do print C equals C. This is 2 times 1. So notice that now C equals 2, even though before was 3. This is now the value of A times B. And the same thing will happen if you do A divided by B, then you will do C equals B divided by A print C equals 2. Let's do a new one. D equals A divided by B. Print D. 0.5. So a couple of things here. If you do print D by itself, D is what we used to store the result of A divided by B. Now, if you do print D, you only printing the string D. And this is the main difference. Print is part of one of the functions of Python. So we install Python, you have access to print, you have access to summation, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Now, if you were to do D equals cosine of 90, we get an error. It's because Python does not know what which is cosine means, right? There's no such thing as cosine. Okay, so for this particular case, we would have to use a library that contains the math functions of cosine or sine, tangent, exponent, power, and so on and so forth. So if you have Python installed, start by doing this and get familiar with it. If you don't have Python installed, this is how you install it.